The dog weighed 90 pounds and had already put two orderlies on the floor. It stood over the bleeding child like a wall made of muscle and instinct, teeth bared, a sound coming from its chest that wasn't quite a growl. It was a warning, the kind that meant the next person who reached for that boy would lose a hand. Doctors backed against the walls, security wouldn't enter the room. The trauma team stood frozen in the hallway while a 7-year-old with a punctured lung bled out on a gurney. Then a nurse nobody had ever really looked at walked through the door, crouched down, and said two words in a language the dog recognized, and the animal went quiet. If this story already has your attention, stay until the end. Hit like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The fluorescent lights in the staff corridor of Harmon Creek Military Medical Center had been flickering for 3 weeks. Maintenance had been called twice. Both times, someone filled out a work order, taped a note to the fixture panel, and forgot about it. The third time it happened, a facilities tech named Ruiz shrugged and said the wiring in the East Wing was original to the 1987 renovation, and nobody had budgeted for a full replacement yet. That was the kind of institution Harmon Creek was. Things that needed fixing stayed broken because fixing them required someone to care enough to push it through, and most of the people with the authority to push had other priorities. There was a broken IV stand in Bay 6 that had been zip-tied to the wall rail for 4 months. The medication cart in the step-down unit had a wheel that ground sideways on every second rotation. The supply closet near the nurse's station on the 3rd floor had a door that only locked if you lifted the handle at exactly the right angle. These were small things. They were also the kind of small things that told you everything about how a place was actually run versus how it looked in the promotional photos on the hospital's website. The website showed gleaming corridors and smiling staff in crisp scrubs. It mentioned Harmon Creek's decorated history, serving active-duty military families in Grayport, Virginia, its proximity to the Naval Air Station, its trauma designation, and specialized veteran care unit. What it didn't mention was that the East Wing lights flickered, the medication cart ground sideways, and the woman who had worked the day shift in the surgical step-down unit for the past 4 years was treated by the department chief like she was something he'd tracked in on his shoe. Her name was Sarah Kwan. She was 36 years old, medium height, with the kind of face that people forgot 5 minutes after looking at it. Not because it wasn't a good face, but because she never gave anyone a reason to look twice. She wore scrubs that were always slightly too large, kept her dark hair pulled back in a low ponytail, and moved through the ward with a quietness that most people mistook for meekness. She arrived before her shift started. She stayed after it ended. She knew the names of every patient on her floor, their medications, their histories, their next of kin. Nobody at Harmon Creek thought much of Sarah Kwan. Specifically, Dr. Raymond Galt did not think much of Sarah Kwan. Dr. Galt was the chief of surgical services, a title he carried with the particular weight of a man who believed that carrying it loudly made it more true. He was 51, silver-haired, built like a former college athlete who'd stopped playing but kept the posture. He ran the surgical floor with a command structure borrowed from military hierarchy, which made a certain sense given the hospital's population, but applied it with the selective cruelty of someone who'd decided that certain people were beneath the structure entirely. Sarah was one of those people. It had started, as far as anyone could trace it, about 8 months ago. A medication adjustment had been flagged during rounds. A post-op patient's anticoagulant dosing was marginally outside protocol range. Galt had been the attending. The flag had originated from Sarah's charting. Instead of reviewing it as the clinical catch it was, Galt had stood in the middle of the nursing station and informed the assembled staff that the note reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of dosing windows and that whoever had written it clearly needed a refresher in basic pharmacology. He hadn't looked at Sarah when he said it. He didn't have to. Everyone else did. The thing was, Sarah had been right. The dosing was outside range. The attending resident quietly corrected it 2 hours later without ceremony. But Galt never acknowledged the correction and never addressed the original comment, and from that point forward, something had shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It was the smaller kind of erosion that's harder to fight because it doesn't give you a clear incident to point at. Galt began CCing Sarah's supervisor on routine communications, framing it as documentation. He started arriving at her patients' rooms during her shift and asking questions of the residents that excluded her, speaking around her as if she weren't in the room. Twice in the past month, he'd reassigned her patients to other nurses mid-shift without explanation, leaving her standing at the bedside of someone she'd been caring for all morning with nothing but a curt coverage change from the charge nurse. Last week, in front of 3 residents and a medical student, he'd looked at a post-surgical note she'd written and said, "Who charted this?" And when she answered, he'd responded with a single word: "Figures." Nobody had said anything. Sarah had not said anything. She'd turned back to the chart she was working on and finished it because the patient needed it finished, and she was good at her job in the way that requires you to be bigger than the room you're in. But she was tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep. It was a Tuesday when everything changed, and it didn't announce itself. The morning started like most others. Sarah arrived at 06:45 for a 0700 shift, changed in the locker room, checked the overnight handoff notes, and did her initial round through the step-down unit. 4 patients, all stable. Mr. Delaney in 312 needed his wound dressing changed. Mrs. Okafor in 308 was anxious about her discharge labs and needed someone to sit with her for 5 minutes and explain what the numbers actually meant, not what the rushed resident had implied they meant. 2 others were sleeping, IV lines clean, monitors running quietly. She was in the middle of writing up the morning check when the overhead intercom activated, not the routine page. The trauma alert, 3 rapid tones, then trauma bay, incoming critical. ETA, 4 minutes. Pediatric, 7 years old, penetrating chest trauma, field stabilized, military family escort. Sarah put down her pen. Penetrating chest trauma in a 7-year-old meant the trauma team would mobilize and the surgical suite would pre-op. Her floor would absorb the overflow if the trauma team needed holding space. She flagged the charge nurse, confirmed her other patients were covered, and moved toward the elevator. She heard the commotion before the elevator doors opened. The trauma bay at Harmon Creek was a controlled environment by design. Controlled noise, controlled movement, clear lanes for equipment and personnel. What Sarah walked into when the elevator opened on the ground floor was controlled in name only. There were raised voices. There was the sound of someone backing hard into a metal cart. There was a German shepherd standing on a gurney next to a small, unconscious boy. And the dog was not letting anyone within 4 feet of either of them. The dog was not aggressive in the random way of a frightened animal. It was trained. It was on task. Its body was positioned between the child and the room with a precision that spoke to specific conditioning. Not pet ownership, but working dog protocol, the kind that gets drilled in over months of operational training. Its eyes tracked every person in the room. When a resident in blue scrubs took a step forward, the dog's weight shifted to its front legs and the sound from its throat rose in pitch just enough to stop him cold. "Somebody get animal control," a voice said. Dr. Galt. He was standing at the edge of the room with his arms crossed, which was the posture of a man who had already decided the situation was someone else's problem. "This is a trauma bay, not a kennel." "Animal control will take 20 minutes, said one of the residents. "That kid has a hemopneumothorax." "Then sedate the dog." "With what?" "We don't carry veterinary sedation, Dr. Galt." "Then somebody figure something out because I'm not losing a patient because of a dog." He said the word dog the way some people say obstacle. Sarah had stopped inside the doorway. She was looking at the animal, not at its teeth or its posture or the problem it represented. She was looking at the specific way it was holding its head, ears partially forward, not full back like a fear response, chin slightly lowered. She was looking at the harness it was wearing, the color and cut of it. She was looking at the short leash clipped to the gurney rail, which meant someone had tried to secure it before losing control of the situation, which meant the dog had a handler who was no longer present or incapacitated. She walked into the room. "Nurse," one of the residents started. She held up one hand, not breaking her focus on the dog, and kept walking, slowly. Not the slow of someone afraid, the slow of someone measuring distance. She came within 6 feet and crouched down so she was below the dog's eye level, which changed the geometry of the encounter in a way the dog understood immediately. The growl dropped in register. Not gone. Lower. Sarah made a sound, not a word, not quite, more like a specific vocalization. a short two-syllable call, and accompanied it with a hand signal so brief most people in the room missed it. Right hand, flat palm, angled down. The dog stopped growling. Its ears moved. It looked at her. It looked at the boy. It looked back at her. And then, with the slow, deliberate movement of an animal choosing to stand down rather than being forced to, it stepped back from the edge of the gurney, sat, and lowered its head. The room was silent for 3 full seconds. "Move," Sarah said to the trauma team. "Now, you have a window." They moved. She kept her eyes on the dog while the trauma team descended on the boy. Airway assessment, chest auscultation, monitor leads, the rapid controlled choreography of people who were very good at their jobs once they had room to do them. She kept one hand in the dog's line of sight, not touching, just visible, a continuous signal. "What did you do?" The resident who'd been blocked earlier, Dr. Finch, second-year surgical, was next to her, voice low and slightly stunned. He was waiting for release, Sarah said quietly. He needed to know someone with authority gave it. "You speak dog?" She didn't answer. Behind her, Galt had moved to the gurney and was directing the trauma assessment with the brisk authority of a man reclaiming control of his room. He did not look at Sarah. He had not looked at Sarah since she'd walked in. The boy's name, according to the field paperwork that arrived with him, was Marcus Devlin, 7 years old. His father was Captain James Devlin, currently listed as deployed and being notified through official military channels. The dog, registered in the field file as Coda, was a working military K-9 assigned to the father's unit, which explained the training, the harness, and the reason the animal had fixated on the child as a charge to protect. The trauma team got a chest tube in within 12 minutes. The hemopneumothorax began to resolve. The boy was breathing on his own, shallow, assisted, but his own. The surgical attending confirmed no cardiac involvement. They would need to watch for complications, keep him sedated, monitor closely, but the initial picture was better than it had looked 4 minutes ago. Sarah had moved to the corner of the room once the team was working and stayed out of the way. Coda had not moved from his position on the floor beside the gurney. Every few minutes, the dog looked at Sarah. Every time, she made the same small signal and the dog held its place. "Who authorized a civilian nurse in this trauma response?" Galt asked, to no one in particular and everyone simultaneously, which was a technique he used to make questions feel like findings. "She's the one who got the dog to stand down," Finch said. "I can see that. I'm asking who authorized it." "The dog was blocking treatment," Sarah said, from the corner. Not aggressive, flat. Galt turned to look at her fully for the first time since she'd entered. There was something in his expression that Sarah had learned to read over the past 8 months. Not quite contempt, but the front step to it, the door held open. "You're a step-down nurse," he said. "This is a trauma bay. The dog needed to be handled before you could access the patient. I handled the dog." "And your patient's upstairs?" "Covered. I confirmed before I came down." He studied her for a moment with the specific blankness of someone deciding how much of a scene to make. Then he turned back to the trauma team. "Get this animal out of the bay. Transfer it to a secure room until the handler can be reached." "He won't move without a command from someone he trusts," Sarah said. Galt stopped. He didn't turn around. "Excuse me?" "He's a working K-9. He's task assigned. You can't just move him with a leash. He'll resist and someone will get hurt." She paused. "I can transfer him." A very long beat. "Fine," Galt said. Just the word. Then he walked away toward the monitor bank. Sarah crossed to the dog. She spoke to him quietly. 2 short commands, a pause, one more, and Coda rose, shook himself once, and moved alongside her with the settled ease of an animal that had been waiting to be told what to do next. She took him to a small room off the main corridor, confirmed he had water, stayed with him for 4 minutes until his breathing had steadied, and then went back upstairs. Nobody thanked her. Nobody mentioned it. She changed the dressing on Mr. Delaney's wound and went to sit with Mrs. Okafor and explain what the discharge labs meant. The call came at 13:40. Captain James Devlin had been reached through official channels. He was currently at Joint Base Hadley, 2 hours south of Grayport, and had received emergency family leave. He would arrive at Harmon Creek by 1600. His commanding officer, Major Tran, had called ahead to confirm, and to request that someone be available to brief him on his son's condition. Galt had assigned that briefing to the attending resident. He had not consulted Sarah, who had been the first to stabilize the situation that allowed the trauma team to work. This was not unusual. At 14:15, Dr. Finch found Sarah at the nurses' station on the third floor. He looked like he'd been working up to saying something for a while. "He's not going to say anything," Finch said. "Galt, about what you did this morning." Sarah didn't look up from the chart. "I know. I'm saying it. What you did this morning it was significant. You probably saved that kid's life by giving us 30 seconds we didn't have." "The trauma team saved the kid's life. I moved a dog." "You know what I mean." She looked up. Finch was 27, third year of residency, still in the stage of medicine where injustice bothered him. She remembered that stage. She didn't remember when she'd left it. "Write it in your notes if you want," she said. "That's where it matters." He frowned. "That's it?" "That's it." He left, still frowning. Sarah went back to the chart. Imbab. Captain James Devlin arrived at 15:48. Sarah wasn't supposed to be there. She was finishing her shift paperwork at the nursing station when she heard him in the hallway. Not because he was loud, but because the specific quality of his silence was the kind that takes up more space than noise does. She looked up. He was tall, built solidly, in civilian clothes that still somehow read as military. The posture, the way he moved through a space as though he'd already mapped every exit. He had a face that had been outside in hard weather for most of its adult life. He was moving with the controlled speed of a man trying very hard not to run. Resident Dr. Finch was walking beside him, providing the briefing. They passed the nursing station. Devlin glanced over. Not at Sarah specifically, the kind of general scan anyone does when moving through an unfamiliar place, and she looked back down at her paperwork. Then his footsteps stopped. She heard Finch continue talking for 2 steps before he realized he'd lost his audience. "Hold on," Devlin said. She looked up. He was looking at her. Not the general scan. Directly at her, with a focus that was different in quality from the way most people looked at nursing staff, which was either functional or invisible. "You're the one who handled Coda," he said. It wasn't a question. "One of the staff told me when I came in," he added, reading her expression. "A guy named Ruiz, I think. Said a nurse from the 3rd floor came down and got the dog off the gurney." "Yes," Sarah said. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that's processing, not waiting. "That dog has worked with our unit for 3 years. He doesn't defer to civilians. He was waiting for a command. I gave him one." "What command?" She met his eyes. "The right one." Devlin studied her for a long moment. He was doing something she recognized, cataloging, cross-referencing, running the information against a template in his head and finding that the results were surprising him. She'd seen that expression before on other faces. She had worked very hard to make sure she never had to see it again. "Can I?" he started. "Your son is in room 214, Sarah said. 2nd floor. He's stable. He's sedated, but his numbers are good. The chest tube resolved the pneumothorax and they're watching him closely tonight." She stood, picked up the chart she'd been reviewing, and tucked it under her arm. "Dr. Finch can answer any clinical questions." She walked toward the medication room. Behind her, she heard Devlin say, quietly and to himself, "Huh." Tremors. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. At 17:10, 15 minutes before Sarah's shift officially ended, the charge nurse, Bellamy, appeared at the medication room door. Her face had the specific, careful expression of someone delivering information they found uncomfortable. "Galt wants you in his office," Bellamy said. Sarah finished logging the medication count, replaced the tray, and locked the cabinet. "Now?" "He said as soon as you're available." Bellamy paused. He had his tone, Sarah. The tone Bellamy meant was one Sarah had heard directed at other staff before it had been directed at her, a kind of administrative finality that preceded an outcome that had already been decided. She had learned over the past 8 months to read the gradient of Galt's communications like a barometer. This was low pressure. Something was incoming. Galt's office was on the 2nd floor, south end, away from the patient rooms. a deliberate placement that removed him from the ambient noise of clinical work while maintaining his oversight through the window that overlooked the East Nursing Station. Sarah had been in this office 4 times in 4 years, twice for annual reviews. Once when the medication flag incident had generated paperwork. Once when a patient's family had filed a complaint that Galt had written her name on without her knowledge and resolved without informing her. She knocked. He told her to come in. He was at his desk, which was always tidy in the way of someone who managed tidiness as a form of control. He had a manila folder open in front of him and was looking at it when she entered. He let her stand for a moment before he looked up. "Close the door," he said. She closed the door. "I want to talk about what happened in the trauma bay this morning. All right? You left your floor during an active shift without clearing it with me. I cleared it with the charge nurse and confirmed patient coverage before I came down. That's not the chain of command. It was a trauma situation. It was a situation that the trauma team was handling," he said. His voice was level in the way that water is level before something displaces it. "What you did was enter a clinical area where you didn't have authorization, interact with a working military animal without veterinary clearance, and insert yourself into a trauma response outside your scope." Sarah said nothing. "I've been reviewing your file," he continued, settling back in his chair. "You have 4 years at this institution. Your clinical record is adequate. No formal complaints, acceptable performance reviews. But I've also noted a pattern of boundary issues that I think we need to address more formally." "Boundary issues," she said, "consistently exceeding your designated scope, charting observations outside your role. Today's incident. The child needed treatment and couldn't receive it because of the dog. I resolved the obstacle. You are not trained in working animal handling." She kept her expression even. "I handled him." "How you handled him is actually the concern," Galt said, and here his voice shifted. Not louder, more precise, the way a blade gets smaller as it gets sharper. "Military K-9 units don't respond to commands from civilians. They're trained not to. What you did should not have been possible, which raises questions about your background that I think are relevant to your continued role here." There it was. She had been waiting for it without knowing she was waiting for it. "I'd like to review your personnel file," Galt said. "The full file, including any prior employment documentation." "I've provided all required onboarding documentation," Sarah said, 4 years ago. "I'm requesting an updated review, standard process for any personnel situation that flags a discrepancy." "What discrepancy?" He looked at her with the patience of someone who had already determined the end of a conversation and was simply navigating the middle of it. "You will receive a formal notice tomorrow. In the meantime, pending review, I'm adjusting your floor assignment. You'll move to the overnight unit support rotation, starting next week." The overnight unit support rotation was where they put nurses they were transitioning out. Everyone knew it. It was how Harmon Creek avoided terminations on the record. You moved someone to overnight unit support, their hours became inconsistent, their cases became administrative, and within 6 to 8 weeks they either quit or created a paper trail of their own inconsistency. "That's not a performance-based reassignment," Sarah said. "It's an administrative reassignment pending file review." "I see." Galt tilted his head slightly. "Do you have something you'd like to say?" She thought about the dog, about the small unconscious boy on the gurney, about the trauma team's 30 seconds, about 4 years of keeping her head down and doing the work, and watching Galt make this floor smaller and smaller for her, one memo at a time. "No," she said. "I'll expect the notice." She turned and left. In the hallway, she made it to the stairwell door before she stopped walking. She stood for a moment with one hand on the push bar, breathing. 4 years. She had kept the quiet for 4 years. She had been careful. She had left everything behind that needed to be left, built something small and functional and manageable, and she had been so close to it staying that way. She pushed through the door. Room 214 was quiet when she passed it. She wasn't going to stop. She was going to her locker, change her shoes, and take the bus home and figure out tomorrow. That was the plan. She walked past the window and saw the light was dim inside, and James Devlin was sitting in the chair beside the bed, his son's hand in both of his, not moving. She kept walking. She got 3 more steps before she stopped. Coda. She turned around. The room had a second door that opened onto the family waiting corridor, and through the narrow sidelight window she could see the dog lying on the floor beside Devlin's chair. Hospital must have cleared him. Military family, exceptional circumstances, someone with enough rank had probably made a call. Kota was watching the door. When he saw her through the glass, his head came up and his tail moved. Not the frantic wag of a pet. One slow, deliberate sweep. Recognition. She stood very still for a moment. They were searching for the legendary soldier Elena had tried to erase. No, that was wrong. This was a different story. This was Sarah Kwan. This was 4 years in a step-down unit in Grayport, Virginia, and a flickering light in the East Wing and a medication cart with a bad wheel. This was a quiet life that fit like a coat she'd put on over everything she was before. But Kota kept watching her. And the boy in the bed was breathing with tubes in his chest because a 7-year-old had ended up in a military K-9's care during something that the field paperwork carefully did not describe. And the father had looked at her in the hallway with the eyes of a man whose job required him to recognize what things were when they shouldn't exist. Down the corridor, she heard the elevator open. She heard voices, multiple, moving quickly, not medical staff cadence. The specific flat efficiency of people who were there for a reason other than the one on the clipboard. She turned. There were 3 of them. Civilian clothes. The kind of civilian clothes that were too uniform in their plainness. Khakis, dark jackets, the deliberate nothing-to-see quality of people who had trained to look like nothing. They were moving down the corridor toward the patient rooms with the focused direction of people who already knew where they were going. One of them had a tablet. He glanced at it, glanced at the room numbers, and his eyes settled on 214. Sarah looked at the room. At Devlin inside it, his back to the window, unaware. At Kota, who had stopped watching her and was now watching the corridor, ears up, body shifting forward. The dog knew. She moved. She stepped into the corridor between the 3 men and room 214 before she consciously decided to, pulling her ID badge as she did, flipping into the body language that had nothing to do with step-down nursing or 4 years of keeping quiet, the practiced, precise authority of someone who owned whatever floor she was standing on. "Can I help you?" she said. The man with the tablet stopped. He looked at her. The assessment was fast and professional, and he arrived at a conclusion she recognized because she'd been on the other side of it before. Nurse, obstacle, low priority. "We're here to see a patient," he said. His voice was flat. His ID clipped to his jacket said Contracts Security Services. "Visiting hours ended at 1700, Sarah said. "This floor is family and medical personnel only after hours." "We have authorization." He held up a document. She didn't take it. "I'll need to verify that with the floor supervisor before you go further. Can you wait here for a moment?" The man with the tablet looked at her for a moment that stretched in a specific way she knew meant he was deciding how much trouble she was worth. She looked back at him with the face of someone who had been perfectly still in much harder places than a hospital corridor. He glanced at the man on his left, and from room 214, Kota started to bark. Kota's bark wasn't the sound of a frightened dog. It was an alert, sharp, 2-beat, the specific cadence of an animal trained to signal threat rather than express distress. Through the narrow sidelight window, Sarah could see the dog on his feet now, facing the door, his weight distributed forward in the way that meant he was a half-second from moving. The man with the tablet looked toward the room. That half-second was what Sarah needed. She stepped directly into his sightline. "Sir, I need you to stay here while I verify your authorization. This is a restricted patient floor." Her voice came out at exactly the right volume, not raised, not deferential, the volume of someone who expected to be obeyed. The man looked back at her. His 2 companions had stopped moving, which was either compliance or recalibration, and she couldn't tell which. The tablet man's expression was the kind of careful blank that took practice. "We'll come back," he said. "I'll still need to log your visit. Can I get your names and the authorization reference number from that document?" He looked at her for one more beat, then folded the document, put it in his jacket pocket, and turned. The other 2 turned with him. They walked back down the corridor the way they'd come, unhurried, not talking. Sarah watched them until they reached the elevator. The doors opened, they stepped in, and then the floor was quiet again. Kota had stopped barking. She stood in the corridor for a moment and thought about what had just happened, which was that 3 men with contractor IDs and a document she hadn't been allowed to examine had come to a restricted floor after visiting hours to access the room of a 7-year-old boy whose father was a military captain and whose case file was deliberately vague about the circumstances that had brought him here. And they had left when she pushed back, which meant either they were following protocol or they were calculating. She went to the nursing station and found Bellamy finishing a charting update. 3 men just tried to access room 214, Sarah said. Contractor IDs, company called Contract Security, after visiting hours. I sent them back to the elevator. I need you to flag it with floor security and make sure they don't come back through another entrance. Bellamy looked up. Who authorized? Nobody authorized it. That's the problem. Can you call down to security? Bellamy's expression moved through several stages and settled on concerned. She picked up the phone. Sarah went to room 214 and knocked once before opening the door. Devlin was on his feet immediately. Not startled, already moving, the way someone moves when they've spent years in environments where a knock on the door can mean multiple things. He registered Sarah and stopped, and she watched him consciously dial something back. There were 3 men in the corridor, she said quietly, because the boy was sleeping and she wasn't going to change that if she could help it. Contractor IDs. They wanted access to this room. Devlin's face went very still. Contracts. You know them. It wasn't a question, the same way his question about Coda hadn't been one. He had a way of speaking in which questions and statements lived very close together, and you could tell which was which only by what came after. Yeah, he said. The word was flat and carried weight. He looked at his son, then at the door, then back at Sarah. How many? 3. I sent them to the elevator. Sent them how? Told them I needed to verify their authorization. They left. He was studying her again with that focused attention she'd already decided she didn't like. You bought time, he said. Not solved. I know. They'll come back. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment Coda moved to his side and pressed against his leg, which was the dog equivalent of a report filed. Devlin put one hand briefly on the dog's head without looking down. Why'd you come in here? He said. You were leaving. I saw you in the corridor. Sarah didn't have a clean answer to that. The clean answer was that she'd seen Coda react and acted before she thought about it, which was the truth. But the truth had edges she wasn't prepared to explain to a man she'd known for 4 hours. The dog flagged them first, she said. I trusted the dog. Something shifted in Devlin's expression. Not softened, but reconfigured the way something settles when a piece fits where you expected resistance. His name's Coda, he said, which you already knew somehow. It was in the intake file. You read the intake file. I read all the files on patients connected to my floor. It's my job. He didn't push it. He looked at the door again, and she could see him running the problem. The particular focused calculation of a man assessing a threat with the information available to him and finding the information insufficient. I need to make a call, he said. The room phone is secure through the hospital exchange. I wouldn't use it. He looked at her. If Contracts has anyone inside the hospital administration, the exchange could be monitored, she said. It's a standard soft access play. Use your personal cell on a network they haven't had access to. The room was very quiet. Okay, Devlin said. His voice was careful in a new way. Who are you? I'm a step-down nurse on the 3rd floor. That's where you work, he said. I asked who you are. She met his eyes. She had a practiced expression for this kind of question. Pleasant, deflecting, just the right amount of puzzled, as if the question itself were mildly strange. She'd used it without thinking for 4 years. She didn't use it now. Make your call, she said instead, and stepped back into the corridor to give him the room. The security guard who showed up was named Pulaski, 23 years old, working the overnight transition, and he had the particular expression of someone called away from a desk to deal with something he hadn't been trained for. Sarah walked him through what had happened. The 3 men, the IDs, the document, the timing, and watched him write it down in the small notebook he carried with the earnest caution of someone who understood this was above his pay grade. I'll flag it at the desk, he said, but if they have legitimate contractor clearance, check with hospital administration before you clear them for access to that floor. Don't let anyone through on a document you haven't verified through a second source." She paused. "Can you do that?" "Yeah," Pulaski said. "Yeah, I can do that." She gave him Bellamy's extension and went back to the nursing station. It was 18:02. Her shift had ended 32 minutes ago. She should have been changed and out the door before any of this had happened, which meant Galt's summons had held her exactly long enough for the timing to land the way it did, which may or may not have been coincidental, and she couldn't afford to decide which without more information. Bellamy was still at the station, working later than usual. "Security's flagged it," she said when Sarah sat down. "But Sarah—" She stopped. "What?" "Galt called down while you were in the room. He wants to know why you're still on the floor." "I'm not on shift. I'm addressing a security situation. He says if you're going to be on the floor, you're on the clock. And if you're on the clock, you're under his direction." Bellamy's voice had the specific quality of someone delivering a message they didn't agree with. "He also said—" She hesitated. "He said the Devlin family situation is being managed by the attending, and any further involvement from you is outside your authorization." Sarah sat with that for a moment. "Did he say that before or after I reported the 3 men in the corridor?" Bellamy's expression answered that. After then. Galt knew about the men. He knew about them, and his response was to pull Sarah off the floor rather than to address why 3 contractors had shown up after hours to access a pediatric patient's room. That was interesting. It was the wrong kind of interesting. "Tell him I'm logging out now," Sarah said. She stood up, collected her things from the station, and walked toward the elevator. She stopped 3 feet from the button. The elevator opened. A different man stepped out, not one of the 3 from before. Older, 50 or so, in a business jacket rather than the contractor plainclothes uniform, with an ID that read Harmon Creek Administration rather than Contracts. He looked at Sarah the way administration always looked at nursing staff, which was slightly above and slightly past. He walked toward the nursing station. Sarah got into the elevator and pressed the button for the 3rd floor, where her locker was. The doors closed. She rode up alone and stood in the small metal box and felt the specific sensation she had been avoiding feeling for 4 years, which was the ground shifting under something she'd thought was solid. She changed out of her scrubs in 4 minutes. She tied her shoes, put her ID badge in her bag, took her jacket off the hook. She sat on the bench in the locker room for a moment and looked at her hands. They were steady. They were always steady. That was one of the things that had never changed. In the field, in the OR, in the step-down unit, in a trauma bay with a 90-pound dog between her and a dying child. Her hands did not shake. She had sometimes wished they would, because it would have felt more proportional to what was happening around her. She took out her phone. She had 12 contacts in it. That was deliberate. Her landlord, the hospital's HR directory number, 2 former colleagues from the step-down unit who'd moved to other hospitals, a pharmacy, a dry cleaner, 3 numbers with no names attached that she would not be calling tonight, and 2 others. She opened the contact labeled M and looked at it for a long time without pressing call. Then she put the phone back in her bag and went downstairs. She didn't go home. She told herself she was going to, and she walked in the direction of the bus stop, and she made it about 40 feet past the hospital's main entrance before she stopped and turned around. It wasn't a decision, exactly. It was more that her body had made a calculation that her conscious mind was still catching up to, which was that 3 men with contractor IDs and a missing authorization document had come to silence a child connected to a classified operation, and a hospital administrator had arrived on the floor immediately after she'd reported it, and Galt had pulled her off the clock. And all of those things together meant that the window in which someone could make this worse was open, and she was the only person in this building who understood what kind of worse it could get. She went back through the side entrance, the one near the loading dock that required a badge but didn't feed into the main security camera line, and took the stairs to the 2nd floor. The hallway outside room 214 was empty except for Pulaski, who was standing near the nurse's station looking somewhat more alert than he had 20 minutes ago. He saw her, and something in his posture rearranged. Miss Kwan, he said, is the captain still in the room? Yes, ma'am. Pulaski stopped. He asked about you, actually, after you left. She moved past him and knocked on 214's door. Devlin opened it before the second knock landed, which meant he'd been close to it. He looked at her for a moment, then stepped back to let her in without saying anything, which was the right response, and also told her something about him she filed away. Coda had shifted to the far corner of the room. Not cowering, positioned. The dog had mapped the space and chosen the corner that gave him the widest sight line. Sarah glanced at him, and he looked back with the focused attention of an animal that had already decided she was on the right side of the room's geometry. They came back, Devlin said. What? 20 minutes ago. Different entrance. One of them got to the second floor before Pulaski caught it. He rubbed the back of his neck, which was the first genuinely tired gesture she'd seen from him. Kid had good instincts, stopped him in the stairwell. Did they make contact with anyone in the room? No, but they're not going to stop. He looked at the bed. Marcus was still sedated, chest rising and falling with the careful steadiness of monitored breathing. What do you know about contracts? Government contractor, military and federal security services. They've had some DoD work in this region. She paused. They've also had 2 investigations in the past 5 years into contract violations. Both were closed without findings. He looked at her. I read the news, she said. Most nurses don't read that kind of news. I was interested. Devlin crossed his arms, not defensively, thinking. The operation Marcus was connected to, I can't tell you the details and I won't, but contracts had a subcontract on the logistics side. Something went wrong. Marcus was there when it went wrong. He stopped. He's 7 years old and he shouldn't have been anywhere near it, and I don't know yet how that happened. But he saw something, and someone in that contract chain has decided that's a problem. A 7-year-old witness. A 7-year-old who can describe faces and vehicles and words he overheard that he didn't understand but that someone else would. Devlin's jaw tightened. Kids remember things. People like contracts know that. Sarah looked at the boy. He had his father's same jaw, softer in the way of a child who still had growing to do. His monitors beeped quietly, evenly. The hospital administrator who came to the floor after I reported the men, she said. Do you know who authorized his access? No. Why? The timing was wrong. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Devlin was already recalibrating. She could see it in the way he stood straighter, and his eyes went to the window that looked into the corridor. If Contracts has a contact inside hospital administration, she said carefully, then the official security channels here may not be secure. Then we have a problem. Yes. I've called my CO. He's initiating a formal protection request through the base, but that takes... He stopped. Time we may not have. How long? Best case. Morning. She looked at the monitors. She looked at the door. She thought about Pulaski in the hallway with his small notebook and his good instincts and no backup that amounted to anything against trained contractors. There's a supply room at the end of the corridor, she said. It has a secondary exit to the east stairwell. If they come back through the main entrance, that's the direction I'd move him. Devlin stared at her. He's on a chest tube. I know, I'm telling you the route anyway because you should have it. She met his eyes. A portable unit can manage the drainage for 40 minutes. If you need to move him before morning, it's possible. You've moved patients on chest tubes before. It wasn't an accusation. It was another one of his not quite questions. In a clinical context, she said. In what other context? She didn't answer. She moved to the monitor bank and checked the numbers. SATS pressure, drainage output, with the practiced economy of someone running an assessment rather than a review. His drainage volume is down. That's good. Lung re-expansion is progressing. Sarah. Devlin said her name like he'd been holding it in his mouth, deciding whether to use it. I need to understand who I'm working with. You're working with a nurse who knows this hospital and thinks your son is in danger. That's not all I'm working with. She kept her eyes on the monitor. The numbers were good. They were going to keep being good if nothing else went wrong tonight, and nothing else was going to go wrong tonight if she could manage the variables she could see. The variables she couldn't see were the problem. Get some rest, she said. I'll stay in the corridor. You're off the clock. Yes. Galt's going to have something to say about that. Probably. She moved toward the door. Coda will alert before anyone gets close. Trust his ears more than the monitor if something feels off. She was in the doorway when Devlin spoke again. The command you used, he said, in the trauma bay, to get him to stand down. He paused. That wasn't something you read in a file. She stood in the doorway with her back to him. No, she said. It wasn't. She stepped into the corridor and pulled the door almost closed, not latched, because she needed to hear it, and she needed Coda to be able to push through if he had to, and took up a position against the wall where she could see both ends of the hallway at once. It was 1947. Outside the windows at the corridor's end, Greyport had gone dark, and the lights of the Naval Air Station across the water were small and steady and far away. Pulaski appeared from the direction of the elevator bank. He looked at her, looked at the door of 214, and came to stand beside her with the quiet recognition of someone who had decided, without being told to, that this was where he needed to be. They stood there together, not talking. At 2011, the elevator at the south end of the corridor opened. Not contracts men this time. A woman in a hospital ID and admin lanyard, moving fast, and beside her, Dr. Raymond Galt. His expression when he spotted Sarah in the corridor was a controlled version of something that had been building all day, and he walked toward her with the specific momentum of a man who had decided that this particular conversation was happening now. Behind Sarah, through the barely open door of room 214, she heard Coda rise to his feet, and from the north stairwell door, the east stairwell, the secondary exit she'd identified 15 minutes ago, she heard the specific sound of a fire door being opened from the outside with something other than a badge. Both things at once. She turned toward the stairwell door and said, over her shoulder to Pulaski, "Don't let Galt in that room." Then she moved. The stairwell door didn't slam open. That was the first thing Sarah registered as she moved toward it. Whoever was on the other side was controlling the entry, which meant trained, which meant this was not a lost visitor or a confused orderly. The door eased inward with the slow, deliberate pressure of someone who had bypassed the badge reader and was listening before they committed to the threshold. She was 8 feet away when it opened fully. 2 men. Not the same 2 from earlier. Different builds, different jackets, but the same practice blank of the face that contracts seemed to issue along with the contractor IDs. The first one through was taller, with the flat-footed entry posture of someone who'd done room clearances enough times that it had become muscle memory. He saw Sarah and stopped, which cost him a half-second. She used it. "Stop," she said. Not loud. The specific volume that assumes compliance rather than requests it. "This floor is restricted. You need to badge in through main security or you're trespassing." The taller one looked at his partner. "Ma'am, we have authorization." "Then you can show it at the nursing station. Come with me." Neither of them moved. That was the tell. Someone with legitimate authorization doesn't hesitate when redirected to a desk. They either comply or they produce the document. Hesitation means calculation, and calculation means the authorization doesn't exist or doesn't cover what they're actually here to do. "Now," Sarah said. The taller one's hand moved toward his jacket. From room 214, Coda exploded. Not barking, the full-throated alarm of a dog who had heard something through a gap in a door and made a decision. The sound in a hospital corridor at night was enormous, and it hit the 2 men in the stairwell with an effect Sarah had been counting on, which was that, trained or not, the ancient part of the human brain that hears a large predator and responds to it does not care about your contractor badge or your tactical training. Both men took an involuntary step back. Behind her, she heard Devlin's voice. One sharp command, and Coda's barking cut to a single sustained alert tone that was somehow more unnerving than the full sound. "James!" It was the voice from room 214, different from what she expected. Not Devlin, Marcus, barely conscious. One word. The taller contracts man looked past Sarah toward the room. That was his mistake, and she stepped into it, moving into his field of vision, putting herself squarely between him and the room, and in a voice loud enough to carry to both ends of the corridor, she said, "Security to second floor east corridor, unauthorized personnel in restricted area." It wasn't a radio, it was just her voice. But Pulaski was at the south end of the corridor, and he had a radio, and she heard him use it. The two men looked at each other. She saw the calculation happen in real time. 2 seconds, 3. And then the taller one made the choice that contractors with illegal access to a hospital floor make when they are calculating exposure versus objective, which was to withdraw. They went back through the stairwell door. She heard their footsteps descending, unhurried, which was worse than running because it meant they weren't scared, and they weren't done. She pulled the stairwell door closed and held the handle for 3 seconds to confirm resistance, then turned around. Galt was 10 feet away. She had forgotten about Galt. He was standing with the admin woman just behind him, and whatever speech he'd been building on his way down the corridor had been derailed by the last 90 seconds, but he'd found his footing again. His face was the controlled mask of a man who had decided that the most dangerous thing in this corridor was the nurse who kept being in the wrong place. "You're not on shift," he said. "No. You have no authorization to be on this floor. 2 contractors just came through the east stairwell with a bypassed badge reader," Sarah said. She was talking to Galt, but she was looking at the admin woman, whose lanyard read Director of Operations, Patricia Weir. They didn't have legitimate access. They were attempting to reach room 214. Weir's expression did something complicated. "That's a serious allegation." "It's a statement of fact." Pulaski called it in. "You'll have camera footage from the stairwell door, and I'll give you the physical description of both individuals." She looked at Galt. "Did you know they were coming in through the east stairwell?" Galt's face went very still. "Ms. Kwan," he said, "I'm going to ask you one more time to leave this floor. A child in that room is in danger, and your security response has been to send administration rather than call local PD. I want to understand why." "You do not get to question someone bypassed an electronic badge reader on a restricted floor to access a pediatric patient," Sarah said. The volume was still even. She was aware of how she sounded, and she was also aware that sounding like this in a hospital corridor was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She crossed it anyway. "That is a criminal matter. If you haven't called the police yet, you need to do it now, or I will." From behind her, the door to 214 opened. Devlin came into the corridor. He'd put on his jacket. Worse, and the addition of it changed his silhouette in a way that she suspected was intentional. It reminded you that the civilian clothes were covering something else. He looked at Galt. He looked at Weir. He looked at Sarah. "Is he awake?" Sarah asked without turning. "Briefly, he's back out." Devlin's voice was flat. "What just came through the stairwell?" 2 men. They withdrew. They'll regroup and try again." "How long?" "I don't know. Long enough for security to reach that stairwell if someone calls it in." She looked at Pulaski, who was already on his radio, then back at Galt. "Are you going to call the police or not?" Galt said, "This matter is being handled through appropriate hospital security channels and does not require—" "Then I'm calling them," Sarah said, and took out her phone. Weir put her hand out. "Ms. Kwan, I need you to understand the administrative implications of Patricia." Devlin's voice cut across the corridor, and the use of the first name, delivered without aggression or elevation, somehow carried more authority than shouting would have. Everyone looked at him. "My son is a minor connected to an active federal matter. If your hospital's security protocols have been compromised, and the evidence currently suggests they have, you have a liability problem that gets larger every minute you don't involve law enforcement." He paused. "Call it in or step aside." Weir looked at Galt. Galt looked at Weir. Sarah dialed. Bob. The first Greyport PD unit arrived in 11 minutes. The second arrived 3 minutes after that. A detective named Hargrove, short, 50-ish, with the particular patience of someone who had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago, took Sarah's statement in the corridor while his partner went to look at the east stairwell badge reader. Sarah described the men, the timing, the contract's identification, the earlier visit, and the connection to room 214. She described it linearly, without editorializing, the way you describe events when you want the record to hold. Hargrove wrote it down. He had small, precise handwriting for a man with large hands. "And you're a nurse," he said, not quite making it a question. "Third floor step-down unit." You were off the clock when this happened. Yes. And you stayed because I was concerned about the security of the patient in that room. He looked up from the notebook. He had the look of someone who is noting several things at once and choosing which one to pursue. He chose the badge reader in the east stairwell, the bypass method. You described it as externally enabled. How do you know it wasn't just a malfunction? The door opened from the outside with no badge event registered on the panel. That's not a malfunction, that's a bypassed reader. Malfunction presents differently. Either it won't release at all or it releases on its own without outside pressure. This opened under controlled external force. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. Okay, he said, and wrote something down. Galt, still at the south end of the corridor, was talking to Weir in a low voice that Sarah couldn't hear and didn't need to. She could read the geometry of it. Weir's body language had shifted. She was no longer presenting as administrative backup. She was presenting as someone who was beginning to reassess the situation she'd walked into. Galt was the only one in the corridor still angled towards Sarah with the body language of an ongoing offense. Hargrove's partner came back from the stairwell. Reader's been bypassed, she said. Professionally. This wasn't improvised. Hargrove nodded slowly. He looked at Sarah. Contract security services. They have a current contract with the hospital for event security, don't they? Sarah said nothing. Yeah, Hargrove said. That's what I thought. Dumas. It was 2,240 before the immediate corridor situation stabilized. Police presence on the floor, a formal incident report logged, the east stairwell secured and flagged. Galt had been moved to the administrative conference room for a separate interview about the hospital's contractor relationship, which he had not gone to willingly. The admin woman, Weir, had followed the detective with the expression of someone rapidly separating herself from the portion of the situation she hadn't known about. Sarah was in the family waiting room at the end of the corridor, sitting in a chair that was upholstered in the specific shade of beige, chosen by institutions to suggest calm without achieving it. She had a cup of coffee from the machine that tasted like hot brown water with a memory of coffee somewhere in its past. She was drinking it anyway. Devlin came in at 2:24:70 and sat in the chair across from her. He looked tired. Not the performed tiredness of someone who wanted acknowledgement, just the actual physical depletion of a man who had been running on adrenaline and parental terror for the better part of a day, and was now, briefly, in a room where the immediate threat was managed and his body was presenting the bill. My CO is sending 2 people from the base, he said. They'll be here by 0200. Military escort on the room, not contractors. Good. Police are going to want to talk to you again tomorrow. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a late transport moved through the street below, headlights sweeping across the waiting room window and gone. The way you handled the stairwell, Devlin said, the way you talked to those men, the badge reader assessment you gave the detective. He stopped. That's not hospital training. It's observation. Sarah. He said her name the same way he'd said it in the room, held for a moment, deliberate. I've worked with people for 12 years who are trained to do exactly what you did tonight. The movement, the voice, the tactical assessment, I know what that looks like. She looked down at the coffee cup. I'm not asking for an official record, he said. I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give. But I have a son in that room because someone in a contract chain tried to clean up a witness, and I need to know whether the person who's been standing between them and him tonight knows what she's doing. Sarah set the coffee down. She had practiced a version of this silence for 4 years. The practiced silence that said nothing here to see without saying it, the silence that sat comfortably in a step-down unit corridor and let people look at her and look past her with equal ease. She had been good at it. She had been very good at it. She said, What was the operation? Devlin looked at her. The one Marcus witnessed, she said. You don't have to give me the designation. Tell me what Contrax's role was and what went wrong. A long pause. Then, logistics cover for a domestic transit operation, classified materiel. Contrax was supposed to secure the handoff point. Instead, they used the access to run a secondary operation that wasn't on any contract. Private buyer, federal-grade equipment, significant money. He paused. Marcus was with me at the staging area because my regular babysitter had a family emergency, and I made a call I shouldn't have made. He was supposed to stay in the vehicle. He didn't. He He walked into the handoff. He walked into the tail end of it. The secondary buyer was still there. He saw faces. And Contracts has been trying to close that loop ever since. For 3 weeks. This is the first time they've been able to locate us. I've had him in different locations. I've kept his medical situation off the formal records as much as I could. But the chest injury meant emergency transport, and the emergency transport meant Harmon Creek, and Harmon Creek has a contract with Contracts. He stopped. Which is information I didn't have until tonight. She sat with that for a moment. The contract relationship, Galt and Weir and the administrator who had arrived on the floor immediately after Sarah had flagged the first 3 men. All of it running under the surface of a hospital's ordinary business, visible only when you looked at it from an angle that most people in this building had no reason to find. Most people. Your military escort gets here at 0200, Sarah said. That's 3 hours and 12 minutes. 3 people on the corridor. Pulaski, me, and whoever Hargrove leaves on overnight detail. It's manageable. You're staying until 0200. He nodded. He didn't thank her, which she found she preferred. One question, he said. And you don't have to answer it. She waited. Coda responded to you like a handler, Devlin said. Not like a stranger who happened to know a command. He responded to you like someone he's worked with. That kind of trust. He stopped. The K-9 unit that worked our sector in the Karasov deployment, 2019 to 2021, had a handler who rotated out under medical separation in late 2021. The dog from that unit was reassigned to my team 8 months later. It was Coda. The waiting room was very quiet. The handler's name was listed as medically separated, Devlin said. File was flagged restricted access. I didn't push it. But the name in the file was a redacted female designation. Sarah looked at the window. The street below was empty now. I've been careful, she said finally, more to herself than to him. You have. 4 years is a long time to be careful. It wasn't enough. No, Devlin said. He wasn't unkind, but I don't think that's entirely a bad thing. Not tonight. She looked at him. He held her gaze with the steady directness of a man who had already decided what he thought of her and wanted her to know the decision was positive without making a performance of it. She picked up the coffee. She drank the rest of it. It was terrible. I need to get back to the corridor, she said. Us. The next 3 hours were the longest Sarah had spent standing still in 4 years. Pulaski rotated positions with her in loose intervals, one at the north stairwell, one at the south elevator bank, one mobile sweep of the corridor every 20 minutes. Hargrove had left a patrol officer named Vega outside the door of 214, young and very awake, which helped. Coda remained inside the room, which helped more. Nothing came through the stairwells. Nothing came through the elevators that wasn't medical staff or the PD. At 0130, Sarah was at the north stairwell when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. Then she answered. Silence on the line for 3 seconds. Then a voice she had not heard in 4 years. We know where you are, Sarah. The voice was calm, professional, the voice of someone reading from a script they'd used before. The question Contracts wants answered is whether you're going to make this complicated or whether we can work something out. She said nothing. Dr. Galt has been a helpful partner, the voice continued, more helpful than you'd expect. He's provided quite a bit of context about your employment situation, your personnel file review, the questions your background raises. It gives us options, Sarah, lots of options. She was very still. The boy wakes up, the voice said. And he's 7 years old and frightened, and his memory of 3 weeks ago is going to be confused and unreliable. That's a natural outcome. You walk away from this hospital tonight and you don't come back, and this conversation never happened, and everyone moves on. Or you stay, and we use what Galt gave us. And by morning there are federal questions about who Sarah Kwan actually is and what she's doing at a military medical facility under a name that doesn't appear anywhere in any service record. A pause. Your call. Sarah looked at the stairwell door. She thought about what she'd built over 4 years. The small apartment. The 12 contacts in her phone. The medication cart with the bad wheel, and the locker room bench where her hands had been steady. She thought about Mrs. Okafor, who needed someone to explain her discharge labs in plain language. She thought about Mr. Delaney's wound dressing. She thought about the boy in room 214 who had said his father's name while barely conscious. One word, just to confirm he was still in the world. "You're recording this," she said. "Of course." "Then record this too." She kept her voice level. "Marcus Devlin is a protected minor witness connected to an active federal matter. Any interference with his care or his safety constitutes obstruction and witness tampering under federal statute. Contract with Harmon Creek is a matter that law enforcement is now actively investigating. And Dr. Galt's cooperation with your organization is now on a recorded line that I will be providing to Detective Hargrove first thing tomorrow morning." She paused. "That's my call." She ended the call. For a moment, she stood absolutely still in the stairwell corridor with the phone in her hand and the quiet of the overnight hospital around her and the specific cold of a decision fully made. Then she typed a 9-word message to the contact labeled M in her phone. "Need a recall status check. It's time." "Voss?" And pressed send before she could decide not to. She had not used that name in 4 years. She put the phone in her pocket and went back to the corridor. At 0148, she heard the elevator at the south end open, and 2 figures in military utilities stepped onto the floor. The escort Devlin had called early, which was the best news she'd heard all night. She started toward them to confirm IDs. She was halfway down the corridor when the door to the administrative stairwell, the 3rd stairwell, the one that served the management offices on the 2nd floor, the one she had not been monitoring because it required a master key that only hospital leadership carried, opened behind her. She turned. Dr. Galt was in the doorway. He was not alone. The man beside Galt was not Contracts. That was the first thing Sarah registered. The build was wrong, the posture was wrong, and the ID clipped to his lapel wasn't the contractor plain Contracts lanyard. It was federal. The particular shade of blue that belongs to a specific tier of federal identification that most hospital staff would not recognize, and Sarah recognized immediately. She stopped walking. Galt's expression was different from anything she'd seen on him in 4 years. Not the controlled contempt of his daily management style, not the administrative precision he used when he wanted to cut someone down without leaving marks. He looked like a man who had made several decisions in the past few hours that he was only now beginning to understand the full shape of. He looked like a man who had realized he was standing in the wrong place. "Ms. Kwan," he said. His voice had lost its register. "This is Special Agent Dorman," the man said. He was 50-ish, compact, with the settled stillness of someone who had been doing this work long enough that situations like this corridor at 0148 in the morning didn't change his breathing. He held up his credentials. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, Norfolk Field Office. I need a moment with you." Sarah looked at the credentials. She looked at the administrative stairwell door behind them. She looked at Galt. "How did you access that stairwell?" she said to Galt. Galt's jaw tightened. "I have a master key. I'm the Chief of Surgical Services." "At 2 in the morning. "Miss Kwan," Dorman's voice was patient. "I understand the last several hours have been— Did Galt contact you or did you contact him?" A pause. "That's something I'd like to discuss with you." "That's not an answer." "No," Dorman said. "It isn't." He looked at her with the specific assessment of someone deciding how much directness to invest in. He seemed to decide on more rather than less. "Dr. Galt contacted our office approximately 90 minutes ago with information about an employee whose background documentation he believes contains material inconsistencies. He also provided information about the situation on this floor that he claimed was relevant to an ongoing federal matter." Dorman paused. "When I looked at the situation on this floor, I found that it was relevant to an ongoing federal matter, just not in the way Dr. Galt described." Galt made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "What matter?" Sarah said. "Contract Security Services has been under federal investigation for 14 months. Contract fraud, diversion of government-issued materiel, and in the last 3 weeks, a potential witness intimidation case involving a minor." Dorman glanced toward room 214. "Marcus Devlin's name appeared in our case file this morning. Captain Devlin's call to Joint Base Hadley triggered a flag we'd had set. We've been moving since 2200. Sarah looked at him steadily. How many people? Enough. He said it without performance. The individuals who entered through your east stairwell tonight are currently being detained in the hospital parking structure. The contract's regional director has been contacted by our Baltimore office. The primary contact inside the hospital administration. He stopped. He looked at Galt. Galt said, I didn't know what they were doing. Nobody responded to that. I want that recorded, Galt said, louder. I provided them routine access as part of our security contract, and I was not informed of... Dr. Galt. Dorman's voice didn't rise. I'd recommend you stop talking until you've had a chance to consult with a lawyer. The corridor was very quiet. Sarah looked at Galt. She had spent 4 years looking at this man from a specific angle. The angle of someone beneath his attention, someone he spoke around and wrote off and reassigned to overnight unit support rotations when they became inconvenient. She had watched him run this floor with the particular authority of someone who had decided that authority was the same thing as being right. He was looking at the floor. The personnel file review you initiated, Sarah said to him. Not hot, just present. The request for my full employment documentation. When did contracts ask you to do that? Galt's eyes came up. His expression moved through several phases and settled on something that was almost, but not quite, the truth. 3 weeks ago, he said. They said it was a routine security audit, active contractor access to personnel files. And you didn't think to tell HR, or me. I thought it was administrative. You used it, she said. You told them what you found, or what you didn't find, and you used it tonight on a phone call to threaten me with it. He said nothing. That call is recorded, Sarah said. I told them it was recorded. I meant it. Dorman looked at her. You have a recording. I told them I would provide it to Detective Hargrove tomorrow morning. I'll provide it to you instead. Something in Dorman's expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. He looked at her the way Devlin had looked at her, and she was beginning to recognize the specific quality of that look, which was the look of someone who had built a mental file on a person and was now revising it in real time. I think, Dorman said carefully, that we need to have a more comprehensive conversation, not in a hallway at 2 a.m. The military escort for room 214 arrived 4 minutes ago, Sarah said. Once I've confirmed their IDs and briefed Pulaski on the handoff, I'm available. Dorman nodded once. Room number? 214, South End. She walked past both of them toward the south corridor. But the 2 military personnel were Sergeant Adler and Specialist Navas, both out of Joint Base Hadley, both carrying credentials that Devlin confirmed before Sarah finished checking them against the base directory on his phone. Pulaski handed off the north stairwell position to Navas with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been awake for 6 hours doing a job he hadn't been trained for and was relieved to see professionals arrive without making a show of the relief. Sarah briefed Adler in 90 seconds. East stairwell compromised and now police secured. Administrative stairwell access to be treated as suspect. FBI on floor. Contracts individuals in custody and parking structure. Patient status stable. Coda credentialed as working K9 and inside the room. Adler had the expression of someone who had been briefed in worse conditions. He asked 2 questions, patient mobility status and primary threat vector. And when Sarah answered both, he nodded and positioned himself outside the door with the economy of movement of someone who did not need to be told twice. She found Devlin in the doorway of 214. He had heard the briefing. FBI, he said, Norfolk Field Office. Contracts has been under investigation for 14 months. Tonight activated something they'd been building. That's not comfort. No, but it's infrastructure. She looked past him at Marcus, still sleeping, monitors running clean. Coda was on the floor at the foot of the bed and had lowered his head onto his paws, which was the first time all night the dog had fully relaxed. Go sit with him, she said. Adler's got the door. Devlin looked at her for a moment. He said, the name in the message you sent earlier, Voss. She had known this was coming. She had sent the message knowing it was coming. Yes, that's you. That was me. She paused. Sarah Kwan is also me. It's a legal name. The rest of the documentation, she stopped, is a conversation for a different time. You sent it to someone. Someone who can confirm my status through channels that contracts can't access, which means by morning, whatever Galt handed them about my personnel file is going to be less useful than they thought. Devlin studied her. You planned for this. I made a decision in a stairwell, she said. Planning is generous. He looked at her for one more moment. Then, Coda worked with you for 2 years. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. 2 years and 4 months. He was the best dog we ever had. I know, she said. He still is. She stepped back from the doorway. Go be with your son. Well, the comprehensive conversation with Dorman happened in the family waiting room at 0230 with a second agent named Park, who had the focused energy of someone who had driven 2 hours and wanted to make the drive count. Sarah gave them the recording from the phone call. She gave them the timeline of the corridor events. She gave them Pulaski's contact information and noted that his radio logs would provide corroborating timestamps. Then Doorman put down his pen and looked at her in a different way than he had in the corridor. Sarah Kwan, he said. Formerly Commander Sarah Voss, Special Operations Medical Support, redacted unit designation, medically separated 2021 under sealed records. He said it like he was reading from a file he'd already reviewed, which meant he had. Yes, she said. The medical separation was documented as injuries sustained in the line of duty. Correct. You've been at Harmon Creek for 4 years under a legal name change that was processed through a VA administrative channel. Correct documentation, correct process. Nothing fraudulent. He paused. Galt gave contracts your file looking for leverage and found a clean file with a gap, and the gap was the point. You knew how to build a quiet record. I wasn't hiding from federal authorities, Sarah said. I was done with the work. Were you? She looked at him. I was a nurse who held a hallway for 6 hours. You were a special operations combat medic who held a hallway for 6 hours using tactics that don't show up in any nursing curriculum. Dorman's voice was neutral, not accusing, noting. The question I have is whether you'd be willing to provide a formal statement of everything you observed and did tonight, on record, with your full identity attached. She had known this was also coming. A formal statement with her full identity meant Sarah Voss in a federal record. It meant the 4 years of quiet with a line drawn through them. It meant that the 12 contacts in her phone and the small apartment and the medication cart with the bad wheel would be a chapter rather than a life. It also meant that the recording of Galt's coordinated effort to expose her to contracts as leverage would be part of a federal file, with his name on it, which was a different kind of justice than she'd had access to at 7 o'clock yesterday evening when she'd walked out of his office with a notice of reassignment coming in the morning. Yes, she said. Dorman nodded. He wrote something. Park was already moving. Morning came the way mornings come in hospitals. Not with drama, but with a shift change, the overhead lights adjusting from the slightly dimmer overnight setting to full clinical brightness. The sounds of breakfast trays and linen carts, and the change of shift voices at the nursing stations. Sarah had not slept. She sat in the family waiting room with a second cup of the terrible machine coffee and watched the light change outside the window and felt the specific exhaustion of a night that had burned through whatever reserve she'd been running on. Her back ached. Her feet ached. There was a tension in her shoulders that she hadn't noticed building and now couldn't release. At 0612, her phone showed a response to the message she'd sent from the stairwell. It was from the contact labeled M, and it was 12 words, status confirmed. Voss S. Honorable. You've been clear for 2 years. Call me. She stared at it for a long time. Clear for 2 years. She had spent 4 years assuming she needed to stay small, stay quiet, stay below the line of any attention that might pull the past back into the present. And for 2 of those years, the clearance had already been there, processed without her knowledge, filed in a system she hadn't thought to check because she'd been too busy building the quiet. She put the phone face down on the chair arm. In the hallway, she heard voices. Hargrove, arriving for the day's follow-up, and Dorman's agent Park briefing him on the overnight developments. She heard Weir's voice further down the corridor, a different register than it had been last night. The register of someone who had been awake for most of the night with legal counsel. At 6:38, Galt was escorted from the administrative conference room by two people Sarah didn't recognize. Not FBI, different agency, the particular efficiency of federal compliance rather than criminal investigation. He was carrying his jacket over his arm. He walked past the nursing station without looking at it. Bellamy, who had arrived for the early shift and had been briefed by the overnight charge nurse, watched him pass from the station. She looked at Sarah in the waiting room doorway. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The formal collapse of Contrax's position took 3 days to fully surface, but Sarah watched the first fracture happen at 0900 that morning in the administrative conference room, where Dorman had requested she be present as a witness to the initial formal interview with Patricia Weir. Weir was a practical woman. She had spent the night with her lawyer and arrived looking like someone who had made a calculation and was prepared to execute it cleanly. The contract with Harmon Creek had been in place for 2.5 years. The arrangement for personnel file access had been framed as a background audit protocol. Contract's employees needed to cross-reference hospital staff clearances for event security purposes. It had looked procedurally reasonable. The piece Weir claimed she hadn't known, and her lawyer had been explicit on this, was that the access had been used to build leverage files on specific staff members. On the specific staff member. The instruction to flag Sarah Kwan's file came from Dr. Galt, Weir said. 3 weeks ago. He described it as an internal personnel concern. I authorized the contract's cross-reference because it fit within the existing contract parameters. She paused. I did not know it was being used to support an attempt to intimidate a witness. Dorman looked at her. But you came to the floor last night with Dr. Galt. He told me there was a security situation that required administrative presence. When I arrived and saw the police, I understood that the situation was different from what he'd described. And you didn't stop to wonder why a department chief needed administrative cover to access a restricted floor at 9 in the evening. Weir's lawyer put a hand on her arm. Weir sat back. The fracture was clean and it went straight through Galt's foundation. He had positioned Weir as an instrument, and she had arrived at the meeting prepared to position him as the architect, and both things were accurate, and neither of them helped him. At 1100, Sarah gave her own formal statement in the same room, with doormen and a court reporter, and her identity attached in full. Commander Sarah Voss, current legal name Sarah Kwan, honorably cleared, with the M-Contact's confirmation attached to the record. She spoke for 40 minutes. She was precise. She was not emotional about it. She described everything from the dog in the trauma bay through the stairwell and the phone call and Galt in the administrative corridor, and she described her background only as context for the events rather than as the event itself, which was the frame she'd chosen and which Doorman had agreed to before they started. When she was done, the court reporter's fingers stopped moving. Dorman said, "Thank you, Commander." It was the first time anyone had called her that in 4 years. She didn't correct him. Marcus Devlin came off sedation at 1340. Sarah was not in the room. She was in the step-down unit, where she had gone at noon because Mr. Delaney needed his wound dressing changed, and Mrs. Okafor was still waiting for someone to explain the discharge labs, and the overnight situation had not made those needs disappear. Bellamy had covered them through the morning and was visibly relieved when Sarah appeared at the station, which was a different expression than Sarah was used to from this floor, and she didn't entirely know what to do with it. She changed Delaney's dressing. She sat with Okafor for 8 minutes and went through the labs in plain language. The kidney function marker was elevated because of the post-surgical inflammation, not because of permanent damage, and the number that had frightened her was well within the expected post-op range. Okafor asked 3 follow-up questions, and Sarah answered them, and Okafor looked like someone who had been given back something they'd been holding their breath about. Then she went downstairs. Devlin was in the corridor outside 214, which meant Marcus was awake and had people around him, and Devlin had stepped out for air, or what passed for air in a hospital corridor. He looked at Sarah when she came off the elevator, with the expression of someone who had been expecting her specifically. He asked for the dog before he asked for water, Devlin said. That sounds right. He's going to be okay. He said it like a man who had not been sure of it until recently and was still getting used to the sound of it out loud. The attending says another week, maybe less, depending on drainage. No lasting damage. His numbers looked good overnight. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. He asked who kept the dog calm last night. I told him a nurse. He paused. He said, "Is she nice?" I said, "I thought so." Sarah looked at the floor. Something moved in her chest that was not comfortable, and she let it move. "I need to check the drainage output before the attending does afternoon rounds," she said. "Sarah." He stopped her. Not with his hand, just his voice. "What happens now? For you?" She had been thinking about this since 0612 when she'd read the message on her phone. Not obsessively, not in the anxious circular way of someone without options, more in the deliberate way of someone who had been given back a degree of choice they thought they'd surrendered and were now figuring out what to do with it. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "The FBI seems to know what you are. The FBI seems to have a file on what I was. What I am is still being determined." Devlin looked at her for a moment. "Galt is currently in the process of discovering what it costs when you hand a federal contractor a weapon and tell them to use it on the wrong person." It wasn't satisfaction exactly. Satisfaction was too clean a word. It was more like the specific settling of a balance that had been wrong for a long time. The kind of settling that doesn't make the past right, but makes the future legible. "The nursing board's going to review his conduct," Sarah continued. "Apart from the federal piece, the pattern with staff, the personnel file, the phone call, Bellamy is talking to HR today, and 2 of the residents have already submitted statements." She paused. "He built this over a long time. It's going to take a long time to come apart, but it started." Devlin nodded. It was a specific kind of nod. The nod of someone who has seen institutional accountability move slowly and knows that slow is still movement. At 14:10, Dorman called her cell. She stepped away from the corridor to take it. "Yes." "The contract's regional director has confirmed the secondary operation at the handoff point. 4 people have been taken into federal custody in the last 2 hours. The director, 2 contract supervisors, and a logistics coordinator who handled the material diversion." A pause. "The men from last night are being charged with trespassing, unlawful entry, and conspiracy to intimidate a witness. The wire on the phone call you recorded gives us the conspiracy charge." Sarah leaned against the wall. "Galt. Cooperation agreement is being negotiated by his attorney. He provided material assistance to an ongoing federal investigation. Him flagging your file actually helped us. Gave us the contract's internal chain of communication. His attorney is going to argue that down to something significantly less than what it started as." She had expected this. Cooperation agreements existed because they were useful, and Galt would be useful to someone, and usefulness in federal proceedings had a price that wasn't always the one you wanted. "Is he going to keep his position at the hospital?" "That's a hospital board matter. I can tell you what I've submitted to them." Dorman paused. "It's sufficient." "All right. Commander Voss." He used the name deliberately, as he had this morning. "I've spoken with someone from the VA's Special Operations Transition Office. Your clearance confirmation is processing through the right channels. Whatever you want to do next, stay at Harmon Creek, go somewhere else, something else entirely. Your record is clean and your service designation is intact. Nobody can use your file against you." A pause that felt considered. "You protected that boy. That's going to be in the record too." She said nothing for a moment. "Thank you," she said. She ended the call. She stood in the corridor with the phone in her hand and the afternoon light coming through the window at the end of the hall, the long, flat light of a Virginia winter afternoon that turned everything a particular shade of gray gold. It was not dramatic. It was just light, and she was standing in it, and the past 4 years had been real, and the years before them had been real, and she was improbably still here. The phone buzzed again. A text from Bellamy. "Finch is looking for you. Says it's not medical, just wants to talk. Also, room 214 has been asking if the nurse who handled the dog is coming back." Sarah looked at the message for a moment. Then she typed back, "Tell Finch I'll find him at the station, and tell 214 yes." She walked back toward the elevator. At the nursing station, she stopped. Standing in front of the station was a woman she had never seen before. 60s, in civilian clothes, with a face that had the specific topography of someone who had been in difficult places and carried them in the particular way of service rather than damage. She had a federal ID on a lanyard, but it wasn't FBI, wasn't DoD. It was the Joint Intelligence Support Element, which was a designation that most people in this hospital would not have recognized. Sarah recognized it. The woman looked at her with no surprise at all, which meant she'd been expecting her. "Commander Voss," she said quietly. "I'm Sarah Kwan," Sarah said. "Here." "Of course." The woman extended her hand. "My name is Aldred. I'm not here officially. I'm here because someone in your chain of contact passed your message along, and there are people who have been looking for you for 2 years, and—" She stopped herself. "You're needed," she said instead. "There's something that requires specifically what you have. And I understand you may not want to hear that, but I'm here because they asked me to come in person rather than a phone call." The corridor behind Sarah was ordinary hospital corridor. Pulaski at the elevator, Bellamy at the station, the sound of a breakfast cart somewhere on the next floor up, the small and persistent hum of an institution that never fully stopped. "I have rounds," Sarah said. "Of course," Aldred said again. She reached into her jacket and produced a card, shades plain, just a number. "When you're done." Sarah took the card. She looked at it. Then she slid it into her pocket and walked toward the step-down unit because Mr. Delaney's afternoon dressing check wasn't going to do itself, and Mrs. Okafor's discharge paperwork needed a final review before the attending signed off. And whatever Aldred was offering or asking or representing could wait until Sarah Kwan had finished being a nurse for the rest of this shift. The card stayed in her pocket. She was aware of it the entire time. Mrs. Okafor's discharge paperwork took 22 minutes. It took that long because the attending's notes had a transcription error in the medication reconciliation section. A dosage listed at twice what had been prescribed. The kind of thing that gets missed in the automated handoff, and then becomes someone's very bad Tuesday, 3 days after discharge. Sarah flagged it, called the attending resident, waited while it was corrected, confirmed the correction, and then went through the discharge instructions with Mrs. Okafor one more time because the corrected paperwork was different from the original paperwork, and Mrs. Okafor was the kind of patient who noticed discrepancies and worried about them at 2 in the morning. "The number changed," Mrs. Okafor said, pointing at the medication line. "The first one was wrong," Sarah said. "This one is right. 1 tablet, not 2. "The doctor told me 2. "The doctor made an error when dictating. It's corrected. 1 tablet. Mrs. Okafor looked at her for a moment with the particular evaluating gaze of a woman who had spent 63 years deciding who was worth trusting. "You caught it." "It's my job." Mrs. Okafor folded the paperwork precisely along its existing crease. "You look tired." "I'm fine." "You look like you've been awake for about a day and a half, and someone told you that was fine and you believed them." Sarah almost smiled. "I'll sleep tonight." "See that you do." Mrs. Okafor patted her hand once, the specific brief firmness of someone conveying more than the gesture contained. "Thank you. Not just for the paperwork." Sarah helped her with her coat and walked her to the elevator and came back to the station and sat down and completed the discharge documentation with the particular efficiency of someone running on the last reserve of functional energy before the wall comes up. Finch found her there at 15:08. He came in from the corridor looking like a man who had been trying to find the right entry point to a conversation for several hours and had decided to stop looking and just start. He sat in the chair across the station counter and looked at her directly. "I gave a statement to HR this morning," he said. "About Galt. The pattern of it. The way he handled staff, what he said to you in the Trauma Bay documentation, the reassignment notice. 2 other residents submitted separately. Bellamy is working with nursing administration on a formal review." "I heard," Sarah said. "I wanted you to know it wasn't just—" He stopped. "I should have said something sooner. When he made that comment about the charting, 8 months ago, I was in the room." She looked at him. He was 27 years old and still in the part of his career where the difference between the person he wanted to be and the person he'd actually been in a specific moment still cost him something visible. "You said something now," she said. "That's not really—" "Finch," she kept her voice level. "It matters. It's in the record. That's what records are for." She paused. "Don't waste energy on the 8 months. Use it on the next 4 years." He sat with that. Then he nodded. Not the performed nod of someone pretending to accept a thing, but the slower nod of someone actually taking it in. What happens to you now? I don't know yet, she said. For the second time today. She was beginning to think that not knowing was the honest answer, and the honest answer was where she needed to stay for a while. But I'm still here today. That's something. He left, and she finished the documentation, and then she went to room 214. Martin. Marcus Devlin was awake and eating a cup of orange gelatin with the focused commitment of a 7-year-old who had decided that gelatin was the best thing he had encountered in recent memory. Coda was on the floor beside the bed, with his chin on the mattress edge, watching the gelatin with the attentiveness of a dog, who had decided gelatin might also be his preferred food if given the opportunity. Devlin was in the chair beside the bed, elbows on knees, in the slightly forward posture of a man who had been afraid and was now trying to recalibrate what his body did with the leftover adrenaline. Marcus looked at Sarah when she came in. He had Devlin's eyes, that same direct quality, not aggressive, just fully present, the look of someone who was actually seeing what they were looking at rather than processing it. Are you the nurse who talked to Coda? He asked. Yes. He considered her. He doesn't listen to people he doesn't know. I know, we knew each other before. Marcus looked at Coda. Coda's tail moved once. He didn't tell me that, Marcus said, in the tone of a child who felt this was information he should have been given. He couldn't, Sarah said. He's a dog. Marcus looked back at her with the expression of someone who found this answer technically sufficient, but personally unsatisfying. Then he held out the gelatin cup. Do you want some? It's orange. I'm okay. Thank you, though. It's really good. I believe you. He studied her for another moment. Dad said you stayed all night. For a while. Why? It was a child's question, which meant it was the most direct version of the question and the one most worth answering. She looked at him, the tube still in his chest, the monitors running, the specific fragility of a small person who had been through something large and was now on the other side of it eating gelatin with the resilience that children deploy before they've learned to be guarded about it. Because you needed someone to, she said. Marcus appeared to find this satisfactory. He ate another spoonful of gelatin. Devlin caught Sarah's eye over the boy's head. He tilted his head toward the corridor. She stepped out. He followed, pulling the door mostly closed. Dorman called me, he said. What did he say? 4 arrests, the contracts director and 3 others. The logistics chain for the material diversion is documented and in federal hands. He paused. He said the men from last night are being charged with conspiracy to intimidate a witness. He said the phone call recording was the piece that locked the conspiracy charge. It was a clean line, Sarah said. They were confident. Confident people get sloppy. He also said, Devlin stopped. He rubbed the back of his neck, which she'd identified as his tell for when he was working up to something he wasn't sure how to frame. He said there's a woman named Aldred who came to the hospital today, that she's connected to something above his clearance level, and that he's been asked to facilitate whatever she needs. She gave me a card. Are you going to call her? Sarah looked at the window at the end of the corridor. The light had shifted toward late afternoon, grayer now, the winter sun dropping early. I don't know yet. What do you want to do? The question landed in a way she hadn't expected, which was that no one had asked her that in a very long time. What she wanted, operationally, professionally, as a matter of conscious choice rather than circumstance. She had spent 4 years building a life defined by what she was managing and what she was avoiding. And underneath both of those things was a want that she hadn't let herself look at directly, because looking at it directly meant admitting that the quiet hadn't been enough. I want to finish my shift, she said. Devlin almost smiled. And after that? After that, I want to sleep for approximately 10 hours and then think about it with a functional brain. She looked at him. Your son is going to be fine. His drainage output was down again this morning, and the attending is confident about the timeline. You should ask about transitioning him to Joint Base Hadley's medical facility when he's stable enough to move. It'll be a more controlled environment for the follow-up care. Already talked to them. They're ready when he is. Good. She started back toward the elevator. He said her name. Not Kwan, not Voss, just Sarah. She turned. Thank you, he said. It was simple and direct, and he didn't add anything to it, which was the right choice. Take care of that dog, she said. He's earned it. She got into the elevator. Chop. The hospital board convened an emergency session on the 14th of the month, which was 9 days after the night on the second-floor corridor. Sarah was not present for it, but Bellamy was, along with the nursing director, 2 department heads, and a representative from the hospital's legal counsel who had the specific expression of someone who had been reviewing liability exposure and found the view unpleasant. The board had received Dorman's submission, the HR formal review, the statements from Finch and the 2 other residents, Bellamy's documentation of the pattern across 4 years of Galt's department management, and the recording of the phone call in which Galt's cooperation with contracts had been explicit enough to constitute its own evidentiary record. Raymond Galt's federal cooperation agreement had been finalized the day prior. Under it, he had provided a full account of his arrangement with contracts, the personnel file access, the information he'd shared about Sarah specifically, and 3 other staff members whose files he'd flagged over the past 2 years for reasons that the agreement described as motivated by personal and professional animus rather than legitimate security concerns. The agreement had reduced his federal exposure considerably. It had not done anything about the nursing board, the hospital board, or the civil liability questions that Bellamy's documentation had opened up. He resigned before the board vote. Sarah found out from Bellamy at 07:30 that morning at the nursing station before rounds started. Effective immediately, Bellamy said. Email went to department heads at 6. HR is managing the transition. Dr. Finch's supervising attending is stepping in as interim chief. Sarah processed this for a moment. She had imagined this outcome, and she had thought that when it came, she would feel something more defined. Relief or satisfaction, or the specific warmth of a wrong thing being corrected. What she actually felt was more complicated and less clean. It was the feeling of a balance restored to 0 after a long period of being off, which is not the same as being in the positive and doesn't feel like a win, so much as it feels like a return to a baseline that should have been there all along. Okay, she said. Bellamy looked at her. That's all? What else should there be? I don't know, something more. Bellamy had worked this floor for 9 years and had the particular perspective of someone who has watched an institution tolerate someone it should have dealt with for too long. He made your life small, Sarah, for 4 years, and now he's gone in an email at 6 in the morning. He made a lot of people's lives small, Sarah said. The email is the same for all of us. She pulled up the morning chart. The first patient had a wound check at 800, and the second had labs coming back from overnight, and the third was a post-op day 2 who would need a thorough mobility assessment because the overnight notes suggested she'd been compensating on her left side in a way that was going to create problems if it wasn't addressed. Bellamy watched her for a moment. Then she said quietly, "We're glad you're still here." Sarah looked up from the chart. Bellamy wasn't looking at her. She was back at her own station, pulling up the morning handoff. But she'd said it, and it had been said in the specific matter-of-fact way of someone who meant it, without wanting to make a production of it, and Sarah felt it land in the way that quiet things land when you've been running on a deficit of them. "Thank you," she said. She went to do the wound check. The nursing board review took 11 days. Sarah provided her statement, the full one, with her complete identity and service record attached. The same statement she'd given Dorman with the personal history included rather than summarized. The board reviewed Galt's pattern of conduct, the personnel file action, the phone call, the reassignment notice, and the 4 years of documentation that the HR review had surfaced. They also reviewed Sarah's clinical record. 4 years of it, every chart, every flag, every patient interaction, every assessment she'd submitted, every medication review. The kind of record that doesn't look like much in individual pieces, but in aggregate tells you exactly what kind of clinician someone is and whether the institution has been using them well. The board's finding, submitted to hospital administration in a 12-page document, concluded that Sarah Kwan's clinical conduct at Harmon Creek Military Medical Center had been consistently above standard, that the personnel actions taken against her by Dr. Galt were without clinical or administrative basis, and that her employment record should reflect no negative notation related to any action he had taken. It also recommended a formal review of how the hospital's contractor access agreements were structured and a complete audit of personnel files accessed by outside parties under the contract's arrangement. The audit found 3 other employees whose files had been accessed, 2 of whom were no longer at the hospital. Those 2 were contacted, informed, and offered the same record correction. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after the night on the second floor, Sarah was asked to meet with the nursing director and the interim chief of surgical services. She went to the meeting expecting another layer of the review process. She came out of it as the new senior clinical coordinator for the surgical step-down unit, a position that had been vacant for 18 months because Galt had repeatedly blocked the hiring process for reasons he'd characterized as budgetary. The salary was considerably different from what she'd been making. The responsibilities were different too. She would oversee clinical protocols across the floor, coordinate with the surgical attendings on patient management, and serve as the primary escalation point for nursing staff concerns. She asked for 24 hours to think about it. She spent those 24 hours doing exactly what she'd told Devlin she planned to do in the first week: sleeping, thinking with a functional brain, and looking at the card that Aldred had given her, which was still in her jacket pocket, and which she had taken out and looked at several times without calling the number on it. She called it on the second evening. Aldred answered on the second ring. "I figured you'd need time," Aldred said. "I still need time," Sarah said, "but I wanted to understand what you're asking before I decide anything." What Aldred described over the next 35 minutes was not a return to operational deployment. It was a program, a joint initiative between the VA and a federal medical division she couldn't name on an open line, that was building a clinical consultation structure for military medical facilities. Specifically, how to identify and support personnel with specialized combat medical backgrounds who had transitioned to civilian clinical work, how to leverage those backgrounds within the system rather than losing them to the gap between military and civilian credentialing, and how to train new clinical staff in environments that served military populations. It required someone with operational experience and civilian clinical credentials. It required someone who understood both sides of the gap. It required someone who had done both things separately and knew where the failures lived. "It's not the field," Aldred said. "It's never going to be the field again. But it's not nothing." Sarah stood at her apartment window with the phone in her hand and looked out at Grayport in the winter evening, the streetlights coming on, the water in the distance, the lights of the Naval Air Station across the harbor doing the same thing they'd always done. "I've been offered a position here," she said, "at Harmon Creek." "I know. The program would be based here, at least initially. Harmon Creek is one of the facilities we're targeting." A pause. "You wouldn't have to choose." Sarah said nothing for a moment. "I need another week," she said. "You have it," Aldred said. She accepted the clinical coordinator position on Thursday. She called Aldred the following Monday and said yes to the program consultation as well, with the condition that her role would be defined in writing before she committed to specific obligations, because she had spent 4 years inside an institution whose verbal agreements had not been worth the air they moved through, and she was not in a hurry to repeat the experience. Aldred said that was entirely reasonable, and that she would have documentation by the end of the week. She did. On the first day of Sarah's new role, a Thursday in February, gray and cold in the way that Virginia winters settle into once January releases them, she arrived at the hospital at 0640. She changed in the locker room. She went to the nursing station on the 3rd floor and found Bellamy there with a cup of coffee that smelled significantly better than the machine in the waiting room. "You're early," Bellamy said. "I'm always early." "Now you're early and you're in charge." "Not in charge," Sarah said. "Coordinator." Bellamy handed her a printed schedule. "Finch has a patient he wants you to consult on. New admit overnight, post-op complication. He says the chart has something he wants a second set of eyes on before rounds." Sarah took the schedule. She looked at the list of patients. She thought about the fact that she would be in this building for the rest of the shift, and the shift after that, and the weeks after that, and that the building had changed. Galt was gone. The contractor access was gone. The nursing board's finding was in the record, and also that it hadn't changed because institutions change slowly and imperfectly, and the flickering light in the east wing was still there as far as she knew. And the medication cart's wheel still ground sideways, and there would always be another version of the things that needed fixing and the people who got looked past while they were being not fixed. But there was also this, a schedule in her hand and a floor to manage, and Finch waiting with a chart that needed 2 sets of eyes. There was also the program consultation and the documentation she'd read 3 times to make sure it said what it said, and the specific weight of work that was real and consequential and hers. She went to find Finch. 3 weeks into her new role, she received a letter. Physical mail, formal letterhead, the return address from the Nursing Board of Virginia. The language was the specific, careful language of official documentation, reviewed, found, commended, recommended, and in the middle of the second page was a sentence that noted that the board had formally recommended Sarah Kwan for recognition in the clinical excellence category of the annual state nursing commendation, citing her sustained clinical record and her actions during the events of January 14th. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer of her desk, the desk in the small office that was now hers, with a window that looked out onto the hospital's interior courtyard, where someone had planted 3 bare winter trees that were probably something impressive in April. She did not frame the letter. She did not send it to anyone. She put it in the drawer because it was a record, and records mattered, and also because the thing the letter was recognizing had happened whether or not anyone had written it down, and she had known it had happened while she was standing in the stairwell corridor in the dark, and the knowledge of it had been sufficient then and was still sufficient now. What she did instead was go back to the floor and do the work. Marcus Devlin was transferred to Joint Base Hadley's medical facility in the second week of February. He left Harmon Creek on a Tuesday afternoon, discharged in a wheelchair that he was very resistant to sitting in and only agreed to after Devlin pointed out that the wheelchair was a hospital rule and not a personal suggestion. Sarah was on the floor when they came through. She was at the nursing station, reviewing a protocol update, and she heard them before she saw them. The specific combination of Coda's nails on the linoleum and a 7-year-old's running commentary on everything he was observing. Marcus saw her from across the station and stopped his commentary mid-sentence. "That's her," he said to Devlin. "I know," Devlin said. Marcus was out of the wheelchair before the orderly could stop him, moving toward her with the slightly careful gait of a kid whose chest was still healing and who had been told to take it easy and was interpreting take it easy liberally. He stopped in front of her. "I made you something," he said. He reached into the bag in his lap. Someone had retrieved it before he abandoned the chair and produced a piece of paper that had clearly come from the hospital's pediatric activity kit. On it, in crayon, was a drawing that was representationally ambitious, if not technically precise. A figure in blue scrubs, a large brown dog that Sarah assumed was Coda based on the size relative to the scrub figure, and something in the background that was either a hospital or a very blocky house. She took it. She looked at it for a moment. "The dog's really good," she said. "I practice dogs," Marcus said seriously. "The hospital has a dog." "I know, I've met him." "Coda likes you more than he likes me," Marcus said, with the tone of someone reporting a fact they find personally injurious. "That's not true." "He brought you his toy." "He brought you his toy first." Marcus considered this. "I guess," he said, in the tone of someone not fully conceding the point. Then, "Are you going to keep working here?" "Yes." "Good." He said it with the finality of a child who had decided something and didn't need to elaborate. Then he held his arms out, which was the universal gesture of a kid who had decided a hug was appropriate and was not interested in whether the adult had expected it. Sarah bent down and let him hug her. He was careful about it. Careful in the way of a child who had been told about the tubes and the healing and had internalized the information. But he held on for a moment with the full sincerity of a 7-year-old who meant what he did. She straightened up. Devlin was watching her with the look of a man who had run out of ways to say what he wanted to say and had decided to be present in it instead. "Take care of yourself," he said. "You too." She looked at Coda, who had positioned himself between Marcus and the corridor traffic with the automatic vigilance of a dog who had decided this child was his permanent assignment. All three of you. Devlin bent down and said something in a low voice to Marcus, who nodded and got back in the wheelchair with more grace than he'd exited it. The orderly wheeled him toward the elevator. Coda walked beside the chair. At the elevator, Marcus turned around and waved. It was a full-arm wave, the kind that doesn't leave any uncertainty about whether it's directed at you. Sarah raised her hand. The elevator closed. She stood at the nursing station for a moment with the drawing in her hand and the quiet of a Thursday afternoon around her. Then she went back to the protocol review because it needed to be finalized before the end of the shift, and the work didn't stop for endings any more than it stopped for anything else. She pinned the drawing to the wall above her desk. The dog really was good. Galt's Federal Cooperation Agreement was finalized in March. The terms were a matter of public record once the contracts case reached its charging phase. He had provided documentation of his arrangement with contracts, confirmed the personnel file access, and testified to the specific communications in which contracts had directed him to flag Sarah's file. In exchange, the federal charges were reduced to a single count of facilitation with a suspended sentence and 2 years of probation. The nursing board's independent review resulted in a 5-year suspension of his nursing administrative certification, which was the credential that allowed him to hold a department chief position at any licensed medical facility in Virginia. The hospital's civil review settled with the 2 other employees whose files had been accessed without their knowledge. He did not return to Harmon Creek. He did not, as far as anyone at the hospital knew, return to surgical services in any administrative capacity. He became, in the way that people who have used institutional power to make others small sometimes become, a person that the institution eventually forgot it had accommodated for so long. The 4 other people charged in the contracts case, the regional director, the 2 contract supervisors, and the logistics coordinator, were convicted in a federal proceeding in April. The director received 7 years. The others received sentences ranging from 3 to 5 years, with full asset forfeiture of the proceeds from the material diversion. The conspiracy to intimidate a minor witness added enhancement to the primary charges, which Dorman had told Sarah was not a common addition to contract fraud cases, and was a direct result of the documentation from the night of the 14th. She read the verdict in a brief filed by Dorman, which he emailed to her on a Wednesday afternoon with no subject line and the body text reading only. "Thought you'd want to see this." "D," she wrote back. "Thank you." He replied, "You did the work. We just filed the paperwork." She didn't answer that one. It wasn't that it wasn't true. It was that it was only partially true. And the partial truth left out the part where he'd shown up at 200 and made the right calls, and the part where Pulaski had stood in a hospital corridor with a small notebook and decent instincts and a willingness to do a job he wasn't trained for, and the part where Bellamy had been paying attention for 4 years before anyone asked her to, and had a drawer full of documentation waiting for the moment someone was ready to use it. That was the thing about accountability, Sarah had come to think. When it actually happened, when it happened the way it was supposed to, with records and testimony and consequences that went on paper and stayed there, it looked from the outside like a single event. A verdict, a resignation, an email at 6 in the morning. But underneath those events was always a pile of smaller ones, a lot of people making individual choices to pay attention and tell the truth and stay when it would have been easier to go, and none of them were sufficient on their own, and all of them were necessary. She was one of them. That was enough. In May, the program that Aldred had described had its first formal meeting at Harmon Creek. 7 people in a conference room on the administrative floor. Sarah, 2 representatives from the VA's Clinical Transition Office, a physician from the base hospital at Joint Base Hadley, Aldred, a military occupational therapist named Reyes, who had separated 2 years ago and was now working in civilian trauma care, and a clinical psychologist named Weston, who had served 4 years as a flight medic before a knee injury ended his operational status and redirected him to a career he described as adjacent to what I thought I was going to do, and better. They spent 3 hours mapping the gap, the specific failures of the credential transfer process, the places where combat medical experience didn't translate into civilian licensure recognition, the ways that facilities serving military populations were missing the people best equipped to serve them because those people couldn't find a clear path back into institutional clinical work. Sarah talked for 45 minutes about Harmon Creek, about the 4 years she'd spent there before January, and what she'd understood about the population she was serving, and what the hospital's existing structures had and hadn't provided. She talked about Mrs. Okafor and the discharge labs and why 8 minutes explaining a number mattered more than 3 minutes not explaining it. She talked about what it means to take care of people who have spent time in environments where admitting that you need something is a vulnerability, how you build trust with them, what they watch for, how you earn the right to be in the room when they're at their most exposed. She talked about Marcus Devlin and what it had cost a 7-year-old to be in a military operations peripheral vision and what the hospital had and hadn't known how to do with that. She talked about Coda, which was not strictly on the agenda but which Aldred did not stop her from including, because the dog was a more efficient illustration of institutional failure and individual trust than any of the theoretical frameworks they'd been discussing. Reyes said, "That's the whole thing right there. The dog knew her. The institution didn't." "The institution didn't want to," Sarah said. "There's a difference." "Is there a fix for that?" She thought about it. "Not a fast one," she said. "But yeah, there's a fix." On a Thursday in June, Sarah Kwan arrived at Harmon Creek Military Medical Center at 0638. The east wing lights no longer flickered. The wiring had been replaced in March as part of a facility update, which had also addressed the medication cartwheel and the supply closet lock, because at some point a facilities manager had looked at the backlog and decided to clear it. She changed in the locker room. She took the stairs to the 3rd floor because the elevator was slow in the mornings and she preferred the stairs. She went to the nursing station and Bellamy had coffee, real coffee, from the machine in the break room that someone had finally replaced in February, and a chart flagged for the morning consult. She sat down. She looked at the chart. She thought about the day ahead, the consult with Finch's patient, the protocol review she needed to finalize, the afternoon meeting with the VA liaison about the program's credentialing documentation. She thought about the drawing pinned above her desk, Coda and the blue scrub figure and the blocky building that was probably a hospital. She thought about the message from M that she'd read on a stairwell floor at 0612 in the dark, 12 words that had arrived 2 years late and changed the geometry of everything. She thought about what it had cost to stay small and what it had cost to stop. The things she had learned, not quickly, not cleanly, in the way that real things are learned, which is sideways and over time and usually at some expense, was that the quiet she'd built hadn't been weakness and it hadn't been a mistake. It had been a response to something that had actually happened, a real loss in a real place, and it had been the right response for a while. The error wasn't staying quiet. The error was staying quiet past the moment when it stopped being a choice and started being a cage. You couldn't always tell the difference from the inside. That was the honest truth of it. You couldn't always feel the wall go up around a decision you'd made until you'd been living inside it for long enough that it felt like the shape of your life rather than the thing you'd built to protect yourself from something that wasn't there anymore. What she knew now was this. The things she was were not separable. The medic and the nurse and the woman who stood in a hospital corridor in the dark and held it were not different people. She had spent 4 years trying to make them different, trying to leave the first one behind, trying to make the second one sufficient, trying not to be the third one when the third one was exactly who the situation required. The draw she'd given Galt was that she'd cooperated with the fiction that she was less than she was. She'd been polite about it, she'd been strategic about it, she'd had reasons, but she'd cooperated, and he had used the cooperation to build a smaller and smaller space for her until the space ran out, and she had to decide whether to get smaller still or to stop. She had stopped. The corridor had been the stop. The dog in the trauma bay had been the first crack, and underneath all of it, 4 years of work that was real and good and mattered to real people. Mrs. Okafor and Mr. Delaney and the 20-odd other patients who had moved through the step-down unit and received care from a nurse who was paying full attention because that was who she was regardless of what anyone above her had decided to see. All of that was still there. The small years hadn't been wasted. They had just been undervalued by the wrong person. That was the line, she thought. There was a difference between being quiet and being erased, between choosing when to show what you had and letting someone convince you there was nothing to show. She had crossed from one side of that line to the other so gradually that she hadn't noticed, and then she'd been on the wrong side for too long, And then a dog had looked at her in a trauma bay and recognized what she was, and she had looked back and recognized it too. She picked up the flagged chart. She went to find Finch. The floor was busy. It was always busy in the mornings. The particular organized chaos of shift change and breakfast trays and early rounds and the phone at the nursing station that never stopped. And she moved through it with the ease of someone who knew this place down to the angle of the light and the squeak of the third-floor elevator and the specific order in which things needed to happen, so that by the end of the day, every patient on the floor had received what they'd come here for. She was not hiding anymore. She was not performing either. She was just there, fully, usefully, exactly as much of herself as the work required, which turned out to be a great deal. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was in the way that things are when they're finally true, exactly right.